process. And now, we can get into the fun part, right? So I've got a lot more in-depth experience with React Server Components, Next.js 13. And I just wanted to chat a bit with you all at sort of a higher level, my thoughts on it, discuss some of the potential negative implications as well. All right, so first up, my overall feelings about React Server Components. What do they bias? What do they improve upon? Let's start there. I think there are what I see as sort of three big improvements. The first, and I didn't really talk about this in this process I went through just because for the most part I didn't run into it, but a big improvement could be not having to ship so many dependencies to the client. Another one would be streamed responses. So I'll talk more about that. And the thing that, you definitely heard me talk about, which was data fetching. So these are potentially some big improvements you could potentially see. So the most obvious one is not having to ship all your dependencies to the client. This is just a big win. I don't think there's going to be any real world site where this isn't a big win. And, just the clearest win, I think. When you need to process some data on the server anyways, and the corresponding libraries that you would use to process that data no longer need to be sent to the client. So a great example of this is, let's say you have a date. And you might send date in some machine readable format to the client. And previously you'd use a library to convert that to, something in the user's local time or whatever. And of course you could do this on the server before. But that people are generally doing this on the client for multiple reasons, which I'm not going to go into, but you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to send this library to the client anymore. You can, convert this in your server component on the server. This is a huge win, and there's a lot of other use cases like this, right? So like I said, it was always technically possible, but I think this just makes it way easier to do things like the right way and, process and convert your data on the server. All right. So yeah, that's the first win. That's a pretty clear win. I don't think anybody's going to argue too much about that. That's cool. We're going to talk about, there is a slight complication to it, which we will get to. But I want to talk about another win, which are streamed responses. So with concurrent React, the server can stream components back to the client as they finish rendering, but before the entire tree gets rendered on the server. So I tried this out and experimented with it in this project that I was working on. And it did seem like a big improvement. Like you could see it was sending, parts of, like basically sending components over to the client as they got rendered on the server. And this includes from the data fetching side, if something is waiting to fetch data, it can render something that doesn't depend on that data and send it to the client, and the client would already render it and start incorporating it into the page. So yeah, this is a huge, huge improvement over before, where the pattern was, React would render everything and, it would have to do it all at once. And, if you fetch data, it would have to re-render everything again, after it fetches the data in the use effect or, with your query caching library, whatever. This is a clear improvement in my mind. This is really cool. I don't think there's too much to argue against this. It's really nice. But by far, the third thing is the biggest win to me is potentially this new API for data fetching. Like you remember how excited I was. It just was so much simpler, right? This allowed me to use that simple await fetch. No need for complicated query caching libraries like React Query or SWT or using useEffect. Like it just, it was so much simpler and super clean. I loved it. at least in terms, purely in terms of programming style and design, this is a massive improvement. And I'm quite certain programming in this style will yield much simpler code and fewer bugs. I really enjoyed it. Of course, some of you are probably like screaming, at the radio or wherever you listen to, at your AirPods or, whatever you're listening to this on your phone, that there's some downsides, and we're going to talk about them. Definitely comes with some caveats. But depending on your situation, this could be an absolutely massive win in terms of the design and quality of your code base and just user experience in general. Okay. And now for the fun part. Let's have a real, chat here about the implications and potential downsides of, this new server components approach. And I want to start by talking about that last win, the new paradigm for fetching data. Well, it's clear from a code and design perspective, this could be an incredibly large improvement in my mind, and is one of the reasons before that I've said that React server components are just a foundational change. I mean, this is the primary reason I think for it. But there are a lot of complications to this one. For one, it assumes you are running a Node.js server. Even if you aren't running it as your main server, you need to run one to use server components. And so you might have to add a Node.js server to your pipeline. And if you have to add that to your pipeline, that adds complication, likely another round trip for data to make between servers, so that's not near as clear of a win, right? And at the same time, Next.js is, really, I'll be honest, at this point, pretty much dependent on you running a Node.js server anyways. So from that perspective, not much has changed. But if you aren't using Next.js and you want to use server components, you're going to have to add in Node.js in some fashion, at least for now. I could see a future in which this, potentially is changed if somehow other languages add support for running React on the server and like rendering, React components in another language or something. I don't really know if any of that's been done yet. I could see that changing this equation. You've got like your Ruby on Rails server. You don't have to add in a Node.js server because somehow your Ruby on Rails server can render React components, and use this new API and everything. That'd be really cool, but I have no idea how likely that is at this point, And actually, this was a point made by Dan, who wrote into the show, and, they were like, yeah, this seems like it requires running Node.js, which isn't at the top of their list. And it's really not at the top of a lot of people's lists, right? Like, it just isn't. And another question that Dan had was, is this even useful for applications that source data from multiple servers? Or what about servers with multiple clients, not just React? So yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for writing in. I was wondering the same thing, so it was great to hear, from you, and so far, to get to the answer, I think it seems to be that React and certainly Node.js, certainly Next.js is pushing towards having like a single or, sort of multiple redundant Node.js servers that sort of act as what I call like the data nexus point. So I think essentially the idea is that you have a Node.js server that fetches, processes, renders, and generally coordinates all the data requests out to your other servers. So your React front end only talks to your React backends. And then those React backends are the ones that talk to everything else. So you can kind of think of it as having like a backend dedicated to your front end. And the entire purpose of this backend is to sort of help out your front end. And I do think there is some sense in this. A lot of the client processing that needs to be done is going to be specific to the client, in this case, React. But it doesn't really actually need to be done on the client. So the theory, of I think the React and Next.js teams seems to be that ultimately some of this processing for a React front end is actually better off being done on a server. So you could really think of like both the front end and back end as React. Like not really separating the two anymore between front end and back end. Just like React is a front end and it is a back end. This is obviously a really big shift for the community. And, I'm not even sure yet how I feel about it entirely or what direction, things will go in. But it will mean a pretty major shift in the way that we write React code. This is definitely a case where I want to gain more experience on larger projects before knowing for sure how this, works, overall, like how I feel about it. And before we close out this part, we also have to talk about caching. So a very large part of what makes this work reasonably is that React added a new cache method. This method is supposed to seamlessly cache fetch requests on the server. So if you have multiple components that all fetch the same thing, it should only do the actual fetch once. So before something you definitely needed to do was like coordinate your fetches. You didn't want to fetch the same data twice in the same data path, right? And I think a lot of people ended up just using like React Query and SWT and stuff, partially for this reason. You'd sort of offload that responsibility to that library and let it figure out, oh, okay, I just requested this. I don't need to request it again or whatever. So the React team has actually added this support into React itself. And Next.js takes advantage of this. But Next.js also seems to have extended this cache method to also support some what they call invalidation techniques that tie into its static generation system. So you can mark a fetch call with an invalidation time. And after that time has elapsed, Next.js will regenerate any of the static pages that depended on that data. And if a page request comes in, it will refetch the data instead of, pulling it from cache. Actually, I think technically it will first reply with the data from cache, but then go fetch it and then regenerate it. Anyways, the point is more that they've extended what React created. And, this is where it gets interesting. So this essentially removes the need to add in React Query or SWT or any sort of query caching, I think. But caching is always hard. It's really hard, deceptively hard. So I'm curious just to see how well this API works. But at this point, I don't know enough, although if I'm going to go off my experience using Next.js and sort of some of the weird issues I think I saw, they might have been related to this. I don't know. But yeah, if it works well, this would be really nice because it'll be built into React and it seems simple, and hopefully they, get it all ironed out and it's just beautiful. That would be cool. Like, we don't need to add these massive client-side libraries to handle this thing anymore. Yeah. I don't know. Time will tell, right? And, whoever hypes it on Twitter, probably, knowing the React community. Something I haven't seen discussed yet on Twitter, though, which admittedly might just be because I'm not that into Twitter. But nonetheless, I haven't seen discussed just how much React server components are tied into Next.js. This makes sense on the one hand because server components rely on having a specific routing mechanism in place and the internal support for like streaming responses back. But on the other hand, I haven't seen much support for anything besides Next.js, and Next.js is at least official support. And Next.js is just not the solution for every problem that React might be a good fit for. Now, the React team says they're working on some kind of more general purpose solution. But until we see what that is, we really only have Next.js as like the official support for server components. And this is, in my mind, kind of blurring the lines a bit now between React and Next.js. Where does React end and Next.js begin? I don't want to live in a world where my only option for using React is to use Next.js. But currently for React server components, this is really where we are. Hopefully this changes quickly, but given the buggy nature of Next.js's current implementation, or at least, getting it deployed to Vercel and everything, I'm not necessarily expecting anything anytime soon. Another thing that is kind of obvious, but we should talk about it anyways, is how this could actually slow your app down. If you need a component, but that component is on the server. Previously, you downloaded all or much of your app to the client. So what the client needed was often already downloaded, right? And it felt fast. It loaded right away once the data was there. This is definitely not the case anymore. And it seemed to me when I was messing around with it, Next.js is trying pretty hard to prefetch things. I'm guessing to sort of make up for this potential downside. So like it would prefetch components before it actually needed them based on, I don't know, what you mouse over. I don't know what the algorithm is, but prefetching can be fine, but it's definitely not the answer all the time. I expect we might see further developments in this area too, in terms of creating a more like detailed API for controlling prefetching. But regardless, this is not necessarily a clear win up front. I think with some good APIs for controlling when to fetch and render server components, it could be another win. But for now, I think it could also lead to worse performance. So there is still, I will admit, a lot to learn, I think, about React server components and sort of this new world they will usher us into. But I have, no doubt that the React community is very big on jumping on new things before they're ready. I don't know, for some reason, like remember hooks, Well, yeah, server components definitely aren't ready yet, and they definitely aren't the answer to everything. But I'm looking forward to seeing how the React community jumps on them with a vengeance, looking down upon anyone who deigns to only use client-side components anymore. And if we're lucky, we'll even get a lot of super nice looking infographics and plenty of memes prodding us down the golden path of React server components. But, all joking aside, I am excited. I think the overall, idea in my head is still that, it does make sense for us to do some of this processing on the server. It makes sense to do some things on the client, and depending on your project and your situation, it might skew one way or the other, But having the power and the flexibility to choose where your code gets executed is phenomenally powerful and a really good thing, in my opinion. I think there are a ton of open questions, and probably the biggest open question is what the community is going to do with this. Like, if I've seen anything from the React community, it's that they tend to sort of follow each other a bit like sheep, and whatever gets hyped, that's where people go. And that's what we end up getting libraries for, and that ends up being what learning materials are created for. And so I think a really big question is, where is the community going to go? Are people just going to jump on this and force us to make everything as server components? I hope it's more healthy than that, and I hope that's not where we end up. I could see that happening. But